Okay, so you've been watching all the latest moves in U.S.-China trade, especially under the Trump administration, and you sent over a really interesting mix of sources for us to unpack.
That's right. We've got reporting from places like CNN Brazil, G1, Carta Capital, Jovem Pan, so some Brazilian perspectives, plus analysis from The Daily Show and Drew Vrathi on YouTube. It's quite a range.
Yeah, it really is. And our mission here is pretty clear. Let's try and make sense of what's actually happened, the key events, maybe why they happened according to these sources, and what the potential consequences might be.
Absolutely, because the core issue seems to be these pretty hefty U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods, how China's reacting, and then the bigger picture, the economic and, well, geopolitical fallout.
Exactly. So where should we start? Maybe just lay out the tariff situation first.
Good idea. So the White House rolled out some really big tariff hikes on Chinese exports. We're talking up to 245% in some cases.
245%. Wow. How did they break that down? Was it just a flat rate?
No, it was sort of layered. There's a 125% universal tariff, then another 20% they link specifically to the fentanyl issue.
Okay.
And then there are retaliatory tariffs added on top, ranging from 7.5% all the way up to 100%.
So a complex mix.
Yeah.
And it sounds like they were targeting specific areas.
Yeah, the focus seemed to be on tech, intellectual property, innovation, those kinds of sectors. The official justification from the White House was, to level the playing field and protect U.S. national security.
Right, the standard line. But China obviously saw it very differently.
Oh, completely. They came out strong, accusing the U.S. of intimidation and bullying in trade. They even took it to the UN Security Council, called a meeting to formally protest.
And they didn't just complain, did they? Their language was quite blunt.
Very blunt, basically saying they're not afraid of a trade conflict and telling the U.S. to back off with the threats and blackmail if they actually want to talk.
Then you have the White House spokesperson saying the U.S. doesn't need to deal with China.
Exactly, putting the onus entirely on China, saying the ball is with China.
Meanwhile, China's reminding everyone that the U.S. started this whole thing.
Yep. Quick reminder of who initiated it. So right now, U.S. tariffs can hit that 245% mark, though apparently things like smartphones and laptops are exempt, which is interesting. And China's retaliated with tariffs up to 125% on American goods.
Carta Capital pointed out something interesting, that the White House never actually explained how they calculated that 245% number.
That's right. It just sort of appeared, which does make you wonder about the specifics behind it. Is it strategic ambiguity? Or just not fully detailed?
Raises questions, definitely. So maybe we should back up a second. For anyone less familiar, what exactly is a tariff and how does it lead to this kind of conflict?
Yeah.
Drew Vrathi had a good explanation, right?
Yeah, he did. He breaks it down simply. Tariffs are just taxes on imported goods, money added when things cross the border.
Okay. And why do governments use them?
Well, typically for two main reasons. One, to raise money for the government. Two, and this is key here, to protect domestic industries by making imported goods more expensive.
Right, making local products more competitive.
Exactly. And as Vrathi points out, when one country does it and the other hits back with its own tariffs, that's your trade war, starting right there. Escalation.
He mentioned Trump calling it Liberation Day when he announced these tariffs.
Yeah, quite the dramatic framing. The stated goal was tackling the U.S. trade deficit with China, which was a pretty big $295 billion deficit, with the U.S. importing nearly $440 billion worth of stuff from China.
So buying way more than selling.
Precisely. But then Vrathi gets into the math Trump supposedly used, and, well, it gets a bit strange.
How so?
Apparently, the formula involved dividing the trade deficit by the total imports and then cutting that percentage in half.
Okay. And what's wrong with that?
Well, according to Vrathi, the logic is flawed. It seems Trump might have mistaken that calculated percentage for the tariff rates China already had on U.S. goods, which just wasn't the case.
So a fundamental misunderstanding of what the numbers meant.
It appears so. A kind of misapplication of the figures.
That's quite something. The consequences of flawed math on this scale could be huge. Vrathi even used that example of tariffs on Antarctica.
Yeah, tariffs on uninhabited Antarctic islands. It was sort of a slightly absurd illustration of how maybe indiscriminate or not fully thought through the initial tariff list might have been, like just hitting everything.
Okay, so tariffs are the big headline. But it wasn't just about import taxes, was it? There were also restrictions on exports.
Right, that's another crucial piece. The U.S. brought in new rules restricting the export of specific AI-related chips to China.
Ah, the high-tech stuff.
Exactly. These aren't just minor components. They're vital for China's AI development. And importantly, they're a big source of revenue for U.S. tech companies like NVIDIA.
So the goal there seems pretty clear. Slow down China's AI progress.
Seems to be, yeah. And you saw the impact almost immediately in the markets.
How so?
Stock market in New York took a hit, particularly companies like NVIDIA, but also Tesla, Apple companies with big exposure to China.
Shows how interconnected it all is. These decisions aren't happening in a vacuum. What about the broader economic picture? Did the sources talk about the potential impact, like on inflation or growth?
They did. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, weighed in. He acknowledged there's a lot of uncertainty now. And he specifically mentioned the possibility of short-term inflationary pressure because of the tariffs.
Higher prices for consumers, potentially.
Potentially, yeah. He basically said these tariff hikes were significantly higher than anticipated, and likely results? Higher inflation and slower growth. That's coming straight from the head of the central bank.
Not exactly reassuring. And were the big financial firms worried too?
Yes. Goldman Sachs apparently upped its forecast for the risk of a recession in the U.S.,
Directly linking it to the tariffs.
directly linking it to the uncertainty caused by Trump's tariffs. David Solomon, Goldman's president, was quoted saying the tariff war has already slowed global growth and presents various material risks to the U.S. economy itself.
So it's not just an international issue, it's hitting home, potentially.
Definitely. And Drew Vrethi took an even broader view, suggesting these tariffs could potentially push the whole world towards a recession.
A global recession, that's serious.
Yeah, he pointed to how global stock markets dropped sharply right after the tariff announcement back in early April 2025, saw it as a worrying sign.
Does history offer any warnings here?
Vrethi thinks so. He drew a parallel to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act back in 1930.
The one linked to the Great Depression.
Exactly. He highlighted that global trade absolutely collapsed, then fell by something like 66% between 1929 and 1934. And many economists believe those tariffs made the Depression much, much worse.
Wow. A sobering reminder of where protectionism can lead. So, faced with all this, what else has China done besides the UN complaint?
Well, their rhetoric remains really strong, that line about don't want to fight but not afraid of one. But there are also signs of concrete retaliation being considered, or maybe even happening.
Like what?
Carta Capital mentioned the possibility, unconfirmed mind you, of China banning imports of Boeing jets.
Oof, that would hit a major U.S. company hard. Very targeted.
Very targeted. And it wasn't just potential import bans. Carta Capital also reported China restricting exports of certain crucial industrial materials needed by the U.S.
So hitting the supply chain on the way out as well.
Exactly, squeezing key inputs for American manufacturing.
Drew Vrethi had some insights on China's likely strategy here too, didn't he?
Yeah, he suggested China would probably retaliate very strategically, targeting sectors in the U.S. that are strong bases of support for Trump.
Like farmers.
Like corn farmers, yeah, or maybe car makers. The idea is to create political pain back in the U.S. Rothi noted that other places hit by U.S. tariffs, like Canada and the EU, have used similar tactics before. It's a known playbook.
It really frames that bullying accusation at the UN in a different light. It's not just words, it's about perceived power plays.
Absolutely. It's economics, but it's deeply political and geopolitical, too.
Which kind of brings us to Jon Stewart's take on The Daily Show. It wasn't directly about tariffs, but more about the, let's say, political environment.
Right. He used a specific case, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, as a way into discussing the broader context of the administration's actions and rhetoric. He wasn't analyzing tariff percentages, but the style of governance.
Using satire to make his points, as usual.
Exactly. Lots of hyperbole and humor to highlight what he sees as contradictions or authoritarian tendencies in Trump's approach.
He mentioned the aesthetic of authoritarianism. What did he mean by that?
Things like, the very opulent settings or those cabinet meetings where everyone seemed to be offering effusive praise to Trump. Stewart presented these as characteristics often associated with more authoritarian regimes, the visual displays, the demands for loyalty.
Like the examples of cabinet members praising Trump.
Yeah, he used those specific clips to suggest a dynamic where maybe dissent isn't welcome and loyalty is paramount. Again, a characteristic he links to authoritarian styles.
He also touched on this idea of truth and facts becoming flexible.
Using examples like the reporting around Trump's physical exam or his cognitive test claims, Stewart suggested a potential disconnect between the official narrative and, let's say, conventional understanding or evidence questioning the basis of information.
And the ideas like renaming airports or Mount Rushmore.
Stewart presented those as satirical examples of the kind of tributes often sought by leaders in authoritarian systems, grandiose gestures of legacy.
But he also kind of pokes fun at Trump's effectiveness.
Yeah, that was the twist. Despite pointing out these authoritarian tendencies, Stewart also sort of mocked what he perceived as an inability to actually execute effectively, a kind of incompetence alongside the strongman posture. It's complex commentary, obviously presented through a comedic lens.
And we should briefly mention that Jovan Pan piece about cutting Harvard funding.
Right. It reported Trump cutting funds, framing it as being against intellectual militancy, but the article itself seemed a bit critical of how it was done, the conditionality of it, so maybe not full agreement even among some supportive outlets.
Okay, so bringing it all together, the situation seems incredibly volatile. Dhruv Rathi reported on some confusing signals towards the end.
Very confusing. He initially said there was a temporary 90-day pause on tariffs for most countries, not China, though with rates dropping to 10%.
Okay, a slight de-escalation.
That's what it sounded like. But then later in the same report, he had to update it because Trump apparently posted online saying, nope, no exceptions were announced.
Wait, so which was it? Pause or no pause?
Exactly. Complete confusion. It really highlights how quickly things can change or how unclear the policy actually is moment to moment.
That kind of whipsawing must be chaotic for businesses trying to plan. Roth even floated the idea of market manipulation.
He did raise the question, suggesting the timing of announcements could potentially be used to influence stock market movements. It adds another layer of uncertainty.
And what was that comment from the Singaporean Prime Minister that Rathi mentioned?
That was quite striking. The PM apparently expressed real concern about the long-term fallout from all this trade tension and drew a historical parallel, warning that trade wars have, in the past, sometimes escalated into actual armed conflicts.
Wow, that's a sobering thought, a reminder of the highest possible stakes.
Definitely puts it in perspective.
Okay, so let's try to summarize the key takeaways from all these sources. We've got these huge U.S. tariff hikes on China.
We've got China pushing back hard, accusing the U.S. of bullying, filing complaints, threatening retaliation, and saying they're ready for a fight.
There are serious concerns voiced across the board from the Fed, from Goldman Sachs, from analysts like Rathi about the negative economic impact. Inflation, slower growth, maybe even recession.
Yeah, and the historical parallels drawn, like Smoot-Hawley, are pretty alarming. Plus, the clear rise in just overall geopolitical tension between the two superpowers.
And maybe the biggest takeaway is just how confusing and unpredictable it all seems, right? With conflicting signals and sudden policy shifts.
Absolutely. The situation is clearly still unfolding, very complex, very dynamic. Nothing feels settled.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe the thing for listeners to chew on is this. What are the long-term ripples going to be for global trade, for the balance of power?
And how do we as consumers adapt to this potentially new reality? Are there lessons from those past trade wars that we should be paying attention to right now?
Really critical questions. It's a lot to think about.
It certainly is.
Well, thanks for sending in all those sources. Hopefully diving into them like this has helped shed some light on what's going on.
Hope so too. It's definitely a situation worth watching closely.